As we look ahead into our centennial, we have a number of exciting initiatives in the planning. I promise to send you some updates very soon, so stay tuned. One of my personal favorite part of working on the Fellows Program is to see the transformation of our participants and institutions. Today, we have the honor to invite back Dr. Joe Zolner from Harvard Institute for Higher Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education to share some insight and recommendations on how each of us can tailor-make our personal and professional development plans for transformations. Joe helped to curate our Summer Institute at Harvard University for the past 3 years. Due to the time difference, he's not able to join us real time, but he recorded his message in advance. Therefore, we will not be able to take questions, but if you have any, we'll be happy to pass it to Joe for his follow-up. So let us start Joe's message. Thank you.
Greetings. I'd like to welcome you to this closing session of the 2021 United Board Leadership Summit. It's a real delight to be with you here and to sort of be one of your wrap-up sessions during the summit. My name is Joe Zolner, and for almost 20 years, I had the distinct privilege to be the senior director of something that's called the Harvard Institutes for Higher Education, which is an administrative unit at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. The Harvard Institutes are responsible for developing and delivering a series of leadership development and professional development programs and learning experiences for higher education administrators from throughout the world. Over that 20-year period, I was responsible for both planning and teaching in a host of different program offerings for higher ed leaders and higher ed administrators. Of particular, I think, relevance and a particular delight, actually, for me personally, was in the United Board setting. I had the true privilege for 3 years, actually. It was the July of 2017, 2018, and July of 2019 to serve as the faculty chair for the beginning component of the UB Fellows program that spent 3 weeks at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for each of those 3 cohorts of UB Fellows, and just had a lot of fun working with and learning from each of those 3 UB Fellow cohorts. So probably my face and my voice is certainly familiar, I hope, to some of you, and I'd like to say hello and good to see you again for those 3 years of UB Fellows that I had the opportunity to work with. But for the older fellows, the fellows cohorts before 2017, I'm probably a less familiar face. But nevertheless, I'd like to say hello to you as well and express my delight at the opportunity to offer some closing thoughts as you complete the Leadership Summit and you think about returning to your institutions and continuing to serve both your institutions and, I think equally importantly, continuing to serve your ongoing learning as a higher ed leader. And that really is the focus of roughly the 30 minutes that we'll have to spend here now, is thinking about how you can continue your leadership journey, how you can continue to grow, how you can continue to develop skills and continue to expand your capabilities and your competencies as a higher education leader. So toward that end, I've set up a few slides here that I'd like to talk from. And just to sort of, as a basic introduction here, for those of you that did attend the UB Fellows program in 2017, 18, or 19, the Harvard Graduate School of Education offering of the UB Fellows program, I hope that much of what I'm about to be talking about here will be familiar to you. You will have heard much of this before, and I hope this session will be a useful reminder or a useful reinforcer of important ideas that we actually covered in one of the sessions at the very end of our time together at Harvard. For those of you that were not in the Harvard offered programs, my hope would be that this set of ideas and concepts will enable you to organize your thoughts and actually begin to develop a leadership development plan for yourself moving forward, so that you'll be able to create an agenda for your own continued learning, growth, and development as a higher ed leader. You may recall in the overview sheet that was prepared for this session, I invited you to consider, even if it was just a couple of minutes, for you to collect your thoughts and consider these three questions that you see displayed here. As you reflect back on your time, perhaps in the United Board Fellows Program, that distinctive experience you had with your fellow UB Fellows, or for that matter, any other important or meaningful time in your professional journey over the course of your professional career, experiences, positions, etc., are there one or two particular either learnings or insights that as you look back on that time, you say, you know, this was really an important idea that has really shaped or informed the way that I have been functioning as a higher ed leader? Was it a particular theory or concept? Or maybe there was a different way of thinking. You know, you realized you used to think this way about being an effective leader, and now you think in this different kind of a way. What were those one or two particularly meaningful and important learnings or insights? Just take a moment, if you haven't already, to collect your thoughts on that issue. And as you do so, I'd encourage you to also wonder and ask yourself, what was it about those one or two things that you've identified that make them particularly important to you? Why do they seem to be gathering or garnering the bulk of your time and attention? What is particularly salient or meaningful about those insights for your particular situation and your particular leadership practice? And then a third question for you to collect your thoughts on is, what steps, and hopefully the conversation we're about to have will help give you some ideas or a plan or even perhaps a strategy for continuing to grow as a leader, to continuing to reflect on and revisit important challenges and issues you're facing as a leader, but to do it in a way that isn't frustrating, to do it in a way that actually represents an opportunity for you to grow, learn, continue to expand your leadership capabilities and competencies. So if you haven't already, maybe I'm just going to pause here, even for just 15 or 20 seconds, just to give you an opportunity to collect your thoughts or to organize some thoughts on these three questions that I would ask you then to keep in mind as we move through the remainder of our time together. So just take a moment to reflect and think about what comes to mind as you consider each of these three questions. I mean, if it's helpful, you may even want to just jot down very quickly. I mean, you're not going to be sharing it with anyone. It's just for your personal use over the remaining time we have here together, just to jot down a couple of bullet point ideas or thoughts and keep those in mind as we move through our continued conversation together here. Okay, great. Thank you for taking a moment to do that. What I'd like to do now, just to sort of frame the overall conversation and considerations I'm going to encourage you to keep in mind here, is just to share with you three key ideas that are grounded in my experience working with higher education administrators over the course of my career that I think are three particularly important ideas to keep in mind as you reflect on a plan for your continued growth and development as a higher education leader. The first of these three ideas, and again, you may not agree with this, but from my experience, I am ready to posit a theory that professional growth, that means growth in your position in higher education, whether you're a president or a vice president or a dean or a department chair or a faculty member in that professional role. I'm going to argue here that unless you consider ways to foster personal growth, to develop new skills and competencies as an individual, you will not be as successful in your professional role, in your institutional role. The idea that somehow when we walk into work, that's when we put our professional hat on and we leave the rest of our life behind, at least for the time that we're in the office or we're delivering our professional responsibilities. I think that's a very artificial and false dichotomy. In fact, who we are as people, what we bring, our values, our strengths, our weaknesses as human beings, inevitably also informs and is the stuff of how we're going to think, act, and lead within our professional setting. So unless we're able to think about personal growth and development, that's going to represent a barrier to us being able to achieve professional growth and development. They come together. They're two sides of the very same coin, if you will. The second important point, again, I hope this will be familiar to the UB fellows that I spent time with at Harvard, but an important combination of kinds of learning, what we're going to call here forms of learning. The most effective leaders, from my experience, are those that engage in two related but different forms of learning and growth. The first is called informational forms of learning. The second is called transformational forms of learning. We're going to spend time in a minute going into these two distinctions or these two different ways of learning in greater detail. But for the present moment, I just wanted to establish the fact that to be the most effective leader you can be moving forward, you need to engage and develop plans for engaging in both of these forms of learning, informational and transformational. And not only that, you need to develop a plan for engaging in these two forms of learning over the longer term. The ability to what I say here, stay connected to the things you need to do better, the things you need to learn about. It's not like you can snap your finger and after having done something a certain way for many years of your career that you would like to improve or do differently, suddenly with the snap of a finger, you're going to be able to do that differently because you attended some amazing professional development experience. No, that's not how it works. You need to work at it. You need to constantly test yourself. You need to gradually incorporate new ways of thinking, learning, and acting into your existing repertoire of leadership skills. So given this longer term view of the necessity for growth and development, you need to develop a plan that's going to enable you to keep these issues, these things you need to be learning or practicing more effectively on your radar screen, not just for the moment you're at the UB Leadership Summit, but for weeks, months, maybe even years to maintain that learning agenda over a longer period of time. So those three key ideas, I think, are going to form the basis for the plan that I would encourage you all to develop moving forward to continue to grow and develop as a leader. So I'd like to jump back now to the second of these 2 points, that distinction that I drew between informational forms of learning and transformational forms of learning. And in order to do this, again, I hope this will be familiar and reinforcing for the UB fellows that spent some time at Harvard. For those of you that did not, I hope metaphorically, this will be useful because I'm going to use a metaphor here to try to explain the differences between informational and transformational forms of learning. And the metaphor I'm going to use is the metaphorical vessel of the mind. And pardon my crude representation here on this slide of this U-shaped object of something. That's our mind, but I'm using it in the metaphorical sense as a vessel, as something that is open to information being provided. So here's our vessel. And the first form of learning that I mentioned, the informational form of learning, metaphorically speaking here, if we have our vessel of the mind that we see here, informational forms of learning are designed to pour, if you will, metaphorically speaking, additional liquid, if you will, into the existing vessel of the mind. And this new information that's being poured into the vessel of the mind is hopefully new knowledge. It's leading edge ideas. Undoubtedly, you've spent some time during the Leadership Summit talking about strategies for managing crisis situations during a pandemic, for example, probably an area of expertise that before this past year, none of us had any idea that we needed to become so expert at that, but how relevant that particular set of competencies has become in the past year. Ideally, informational forms of learning would be recent. You know, like if you're reading an article on some new thing, you'd want it to be a recent copyrighted article, right? Because that would mean it's the current information. It's the latest thing to know. It's important knowledge. It's existing ideas that you're not aware of that you want to learn more about. So in this informational form of learning, we're metaphorically pouring all of that new, current, contemporary, important to know kind of information into the vessel of the mind. And ideally, as we see in this picture here, filling it right up to the brim, you know, right to the tippy top of our vessel of the mind, so we maximize the amount of new information that we're able to benefit from and put into practice as educational leaders. So, an important form of learning, an important form of professional growth for all of us, but it's only one type of learning. And if the informational form of learning is designed to pour existing knowledge into the existing vessel of the mind, transformational forms of learning are actually intended to do something very different. And I've attempted in this slide to show that rather than pour existing knowledge into the existing vessel of the mind, transformational forms of learning and types of learning are designed to actually change the shape of the vessel. And when you see those arrows, what those arrows do are kind of pushing the vessel. It's altering the shape. It's not exactly the same. And you'll also note that by those arrows pushing it out, it's not only changing the shape of the vessel, it's actually increasing the capacity of the newly shaped vessel. So I'm going to see if I can move my cursor here. So if you can see from where my cursor is, these areas that I'm just highlighting with my cursor, all of that is new capacity. If we were to fill up this new reshaped vessel with liquid, with water, whatever, there would be a lot more water we could fit in there. So we've increased our capacity to learn and know even more, which is a good thing, right? But what we've also done is we've changed our mind, if you will. We've reshaped our mind, where we understand things differently. We have different perspectives. We have a different way of making sense of the world, of making sense of what the challenges are that we're facing as higher education leaders. So from my experience, the large majority of professional development or leadership development work and programs and seminars, etc., rely, in my opinion, too much on conveying informational forms of learning and not as much time and attention being spent on developing transformational and fostering transformational forms of learning. My argument is both of these are equally important and equally necessary for you to be thinking about and for you to be focusing on in your leadership development agenda moving forward. And oftentimes it requires greater attention and focus on this transformational form of learning, because we're going to be inundated typically with a lot of new information and informational forms. So we need to make sure that we're not only taking that information in to the existing vessel of the mind, but we're also thinking about ways, how can I expand my repertoire? How can I think differently about these new challenges and issues that I'm facing? In other words, how can we make sure we're also attentive to and engaging in transformational forms of learning as well? Maybe to help you get a better handle on the distinctions between these two forms of learning that I've just metaphorically sketched out. Here you see on this slide, I hope, some ways in which you'll see the differences and the different ways you would approach your leadership development, your professional learning, when thinking in an informational way versus a transformational way. As we've mentioned, the informational way is you're filling the existing vessel, where in the transformational way, you're attempting to alter the shape of the vessel, alter the way you think or make sense of the world. Informational forms of learning are designed largely to make things that you're not familiar with, things you don't really know much about now, more familiar. You're learning a new thing that you didn't know about before. Transformational forms of learning are actually trying to do the opposite of that, something that you know, something you've been practicing, something you've been doing for a long time. It's designed to make that less familiar, make you question that, or make you say, oh, well, I've been doing it this way for so long. By doing it that way, am I missing something? Am I missing an opportunity to do it a different way that might be more effective than the way I've been doing it up to this point in time? So it's really designed, transformational learning is designed to shake up your thinking, to make you feel less comfortable or less familiar with your leadership circumstances and environment. Another way maybe to think about this, we all have our smartphones, and another maybe metaphorical way to think about this is informational learning is really designed to kind of download the latest app or the new app, that's going to help you do something even more effectively or efficiently. Whereas transformational forms of learning are really, it's not about downloading apps, it's about installing a new operating system, a whole new way to make connections, and a whole new way that our mind or our leadership behaviors might be playing out, or we might want to be thinking about how to exercise leadership. Informational learning tends to be focusing on, what do I need to know now to be more effective in my role? It's short-term knowing, as opposed to, in the transformational sense, longer-term growing and expanding the conceptual repertoire and thinking in more nuanced or different ways about how I can function effectively as a leader. And I think another important distinction between these two forms of learning, informational forms of learning are designed to learn current mental models and focus on existing expertise. Whereas if learning is the focus of informational forms, unlearning, that's UN learning, is the predominant focus of transformational forms of learning. And by unlearning, I mean not assuming that knee-jerk reaction to, oh, whenever I face this situation, this is how I handle it. I've learned that that's the way I'm supposed to handle this. By handling it only that particular way, you might be missing out on alternative ways to handle the challenge in an as effective or maybe a more effective way than how you've learned to handle it up to that point. So if we can unlearn those habits that we've developed or those familiar ways that we approach problems or analyze problems, it's about unlearning certain things in order to be open to learning in different new ways of learning. And the last point here is that the informational forms of learning take on more of an analytic reasoning perspective, more of a rational, this is the existing body of knowledge and I want to pour that into my vessel, if you will. Where transformational learning, that's much more elastic, if you will. It's a world of ambiguity. It's a world of competing demands. It's a more nuanced, there's a grayer area as opposed to just black and white in the situation. And the ability to think in a more elastic, flexible, evolving kind of a way is important in the transformational learning setting. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better focus on what we're talking about or what I'm talking about when I discuss informational forms of learning versus transformational. Again, remember, they're both important. I'm not saying one is better than the other. They're equally necessary for you to be pursuing in your ongoing leadership development work and growing and learning. But don't preference, which I think typically from my experience, we tend to preference the informational learning at the expense of transformational forms of learning. So with that said, I would like now to return to the very set of questions that I introduced to you at the very beginning of this session, and that I asked you to keep in mind or maybe jot a couple of thoughts down about these. But now let's revisit these questions in light of the conversation that we've just had here regarding informational and transformational forms of learning. As you think back, maybe it was your UB Fellows experience. Maybe there was a particular learning or takeaway that you thought was really valuable there. Or perhaps you thought of something that was outside of the formal UB Fellows program, but was nevertheless a really important insight or learning that you derived in your professional work at some point in your career. Or maybe there was both. Maybe you thought of something from the UB experience and something from outside the UB experience. Regardless, whatever occurred to you as being an important insight, my question would be, how would you characterize that insight? Do you think that it was largely an informational insight or learning? Or do you think it was largely a transformational insight or learning? Or maybe if you pick two, maybe one was informational, one was transformational, which is great. But to the extent that it was only in one of those two categories, what do you need to do in your ongoing leadership work to address the category of learning that the insights you've pulled up now didn't fall into? How can you ensure that you are pursuing learning and professional growth in ways that are tapping into both the informational and the transformational forms of learning and development? The second question here is, why were those one or two things that you identified important? The way that you understand why the importance of those insights might also help you determine if you're thinking and operating largely in an informational kind of a way versus a transformational kind of a way. For example, if one of those insights was, oh, I learned how to do zero-based budgeting. That, like, I was really nervous about financial administration, and I learned zero-based budgeting, and that's been great because it's made me a better dean because I now know that and I can teach other people how to do that, and it's been a key learning for me over the course of my career. That's terrific, but that's also a largely informational form of meaning that you're associating with that learning. We could think of examples that would also be transformational. So as you think about the basis for the importance or the value that you've assigned to that insight or that learning, reflect on whether you think it's largely informational versus transformational. And whichever one it is, what steps can you take to also develop yourself in the area that you're not as focused on or you haven't emphasized as much in your professional growth and your professional learning to date? And then the third question here would be, what steps should you be taking to continue to foster growth and development? I now realize that I've been largely, in the informational form of learning agenda for the last several years. I need to develop more transformational forms of learning and growth and think differently about the situations I'm encountering. One of the ways that you can be helped along with that would be with your UB Fellows colleagues, for example. Could you stay in touch with them? Could you have virtual check-in meetings over every quarter or every month or some periodic way for you to say to them, I need to learn more about this, or this is a transformational issue that I really want to focus on, and maintain that connection over time to that issue or that challenge or that weakness in your leadership repertoire, or maybe it's a blind spot in your learning. I would encourage you to utilize your terrific peers and colleagues and friends that you've developed in the UB Fellows program, as well as any other respected colleagues on your campuses or in your professional networks that can also help you continue to think about, wrestle, and grapple with these problems in a way that will really foster your continued growth and learning. So take a minute to revisit these questions and see what action agenda you can develop from these questions that will enable you to become an even more effective, more fully developed, informational and transformational leader in the future. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention here. It's been an absolute delight to be able to reconnect with the United Board and with the United Board Fellows program. I thank you for the opportunity to have been with you during this session, and I wish all of you continued luck, continued success in your leadership careers and in your personal lives as well. So thank you very much.